Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at deborahrrichardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the monthly or annual plan and also to download a 2021 training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. I receive questions all the time on the vendor process. Maybe on the next episode, I will share the top 3 that I received, but today I wanted to share 3 not so frequently asked questions that may resonate with you, especially given the changes so many vendor teams put into place as a result of the changes of the past 18 months. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 165. 3 not so frequently asked questions when onboarding new vendors. Now, I always talk about the fact that I have a training pass. So I have a vendor process team training pass where for one rate, you can sign up your whole team and then you get access to 52 weeks. Actually, it's probably 49 with the holidays. But every Thursday, there is a weekly training on a different topic. And I have a schedule where you can, sign up, look to see what you want to sign up for, and then sign up for that. I also have some separate trainings that are on Wednesdays that other people pay for, that the folks in the with the training pass, those members get that for free. But I also offer on Fridays weekly Q&A sessions, and those Q&A sessions are 2 hours long, and it's really a drop-in type of thing because who wants to spend 2 hours on a Friday asking questions? But I will tell you, I spend 2 hours every Friday of my time just being on that call, and people drop in, ask their questions, get their responses, and leave. And then some folks will drop in and they will stay on the call to see what pain points and responses are out there with other vendor teams. So most drop in and drop off. I, however, am on the entire 2-hour period. So I do get a lot of questions, and a lot of them are the same questions. So I get questions that way. And then I am also with the organization called IOFM, the Institute of Finance and Management. I am the expert for all vendor management or vendor maintenance category questions. So I get a lot of questions from there as well. But I have 3 questions that I think at least 2 of them are a result of the fact that there are some people that are processing in a hybrid situation, processing vendor requests in a hybrid situation, and there are some people who experience fraud or want to just try to avoid fraud and have made some changes and asked about, the feasibility of the changes that they're thinking about putting into place. And so we're going to start with actually that one. And this is a question of a vendor team that put a change into place to kind of split up who's doing what task to try to combat external fraud. So let's get into the first one. The first not so frequently asked question is, when you're onboarding a new supplier, does one person do the entire task? Or do you split the job and have one person do the initial setup and a separate person or department take care of the banking information? And this is why I say it appears to be a change because they are trying to offset the fraud trend with changing existing banking. And so here's my answer to that. When onboarding a vendor using a manual process, right, because they're not using a vendor self-registration portal, one team member within a department can handle all related tasks. And here's a high level of what I see that being based on my best practices and recommendations to avoid fraud, compliance fines, or compliance penalties, and just overall bad vendor data. So step one would be to authenticate the requester, the vendor or the employee who submitted the request on behalf of the vendor. And then once you authenticate them, you need to review the supporting documentation that was submitted, and next, perform the applicable vendor validation. So that's the IRS 10 match, the Ofac watch list, check other, country registration numbers for vendors. So it's not all about the IRS 10 match, right? If you have a vendor, a foreign vendor, that vendor may have a VAT number, they may have a GST number, they may have a business number if they're Canadian. And so you need to check validate those numbers as well, as long as there's a resource. And if you want to know about resources, I will put a link in the show notes that has it's a link to my vendor validation resource reference list with resource links. So it's like 25 different validations, and you can check to make sure you're doing all the validations possible for your vendor. But anyway, so that's step 3. And then the next step is performing confirmation for changes to existing vendor data. And so I put that in there just because they did mention the banking. And so that can be done for banking, also for remit addresses as well, because I know a lot of you are still out there with checks. And then also for emails, because emails are required for confirmations, and you just don't want to change one because the fraudster sent it to you, right? So you want to do confirmations for that. And that is, of course, unless you use another method for authentication, but that is another podcast, which I probably have done one on there on that topic of authenticating the data. So you don't have to perform that confirmation phone call, right? Because it's so hard to get the vendors on the phone. But in any event, the next step then would be data entry into the accounting system or ERP once you have validated all that information is correct. And then the last step would be sending the welcome letter to the new vendor, or sending a notification if you made a change to an existing vendor, letting them know that you made a change to their account. And so that's really it at a high level. You may be doing some of those, you may not be doing all of them, but it's a great high level to kind of base this answer or my response on. And some organizations may choose to split those tasks to different team members or different departments due to limited staff, especially now, because I know a lot of accounts payable departments are lightly staffed, and that's not good news going into year end, but it's just a reality. But one aspect to keep in mind when determining if or how these tasks will be split is least privilege access. And least privilege access reduces fraud because it requires that access to vendor sensitive information, banking, social security number, be restricted to only those that need access to that information. So when performing those steps, the more team members that are required in the process, the more team members that have access to vendor sensitive data, either within the vendor master file or just through handling the supporting documentation. For example, if there are multiple team members that all have access to edit the vendor master file, and thus already have access to vendor sensitive information, and the steps are split up between those team members, that should not be an issue. However, if team members outside of those that have access to edit the vendor master file are now brought into the process, then those new team members will now be exposed to the vendor sensitive information and will have access to perpetrate internal fraud or will now be susceptible to release vendor sensitive data in an external fraud scheme. So now you've got more people that can be social engineered. And a great example of that is I worked with a specific client, and they had initially had that confirmation phone call being done by someone outside of the vendor, outside of the accounts payable vendor team, which means that now that person had access to the bank account information, which is sensitive data. And they actually were sending, because they would save it all in the same drive or folder, and they would give that person that was in a different department, they gave them access to it. And so now they had that new person or person in a different department had access to the W-9, which the W-9 could have a social security number on it. They had access to the banking, of course, because they had to call and confirm. And so now that new employee or employee that's outside of the vendor team had access to that sensitive information, which increases the potential for both internal and external fraud. External fraud because they could be social engineered and reveal that sensitive information, and then internal fraud because they could change that information to an account that they control. And so I don't recommend that be done. I do recommend that if the job be split, it be split between team members that already have access. All right, the second least frequently asked questions is around 10-check. So I talk about 10check.com all the time. I wish they had an affiliate program, but I know that there are other resources out there that you can use that do what 10check does. So 10check, for those of you that are not aware, they are a service, a website that you can get a subscription for, sign up all your people to do IRS 10 matches. It's a lot quicker than waiting on your individual team members to register with the IRS. E-services in order to do 10 matches. Yes, the IRS is free. 10check.com is a paid service, but if you don't want to wait, or if you're dealing with a lot of contractors, it's an easy way to get people to do, your team members to complete those IRS 10 matches without going through the setup process or the registration process for the IRS. In addition to that, it also allows you to check the address, and many of us were going on to the USPS. I think it's a zip code lookup tool, and we were doing the validation of the address and also getting the format, and IRS or 10check.com will do that as well. And then if you're separately from the IRS 10 match and the address lookup, now going to do the watch list validations to make sure your vendor is not on a watch list, then there was another site that you can go to do like Ofac. And if you're a hospital, you would also do the Office of Inspector General. If you are a government agency, then you would also look at SAM, the System of Award, and they have an exclusion list. And so you're not supposed to be doing vendors with those and those lists. And so you may have multiple different places that you're going to do the 10 match, the address validation, and then the watch list validation. And 10check has all of those. So it also has watch lists. As a matter of fact, it has 44 different watch lists. You don't have to turn them all on, but they are there. But in any event, so it has all of that. It also has the Social Security Death Master File check as well. So if you've got an SSN, you can verify that a fraudster is not giving you a SSN or a social security number from a person that is deceased. So it will do that check against the Social Security Administration record. So it's got a lot of stuff kind of balled up into one, so you're only doing one search. But what it doesn't have is it does not have a way to search for missing tax IDs. Now, if you have a tax ID and you don't have a name or you don't know what the right name is, you can put the tax ID in there and just put any name in the legal name, and it'll search that against EIN records. And if the legal name is in, if it's an EIN you entered in and there's a legal name in the EIN database, then 10check will pop that legal name up. So then you can figure out what their legal name should be. And you don't get that with the IRS 10 match, which for me, I think that's worth it, or it was when I was a practitioner for my team, because then we could tell those folks when we were dealing with people at the vendor's business that just didn't know how to fill it out correctly, didn't know how to fill out that W-9 correctly. Maybe they were putting the DBA name in the legal name because that's what they saw in their invoices, not realizing that that's not the structure of their company. And so we could tell that. But long way to say that no, it does not check for missing tax IDs. So and I know the timing of this podcast when it's being published is Thursday, December 16th. And so you are all now probably trying to look at your vendor master file to see how many tax IDs you have missing, to start doing those bulk uploads from the to the IRS or 10check.com, because they offer it as well. So you're now identifying or noticing that some of those are missing. And so if you are cleaning your vendor master file and are missing tax IDs, the best way that I suggest is to just contact the vendor, send them a W-9 so that you have supporting documentation, and have them send it back to you. And then you can do the IRS 10 match. And if that is successful, update your vendor record. That is the best way to get that done. It may take some time, and yes, it's all manual, but go ahead and that to me is the best way. Now, alternatively, there are some other options. So the Security Exchange Commission has a tool. It's called Edgar. And if it's a public company, you can search Edgar. And it's a database, I believe. It's a database or tool. I may not be describing it correctly, but you can search and you can see if that is a public company. You can look at the documents that they have filed previously, and the tax IDs may be listed on some of those financial reporting documents. So for public companies, that's a great way to go. If you have nonprofit vendors, there is a platform or website called Melissa Data, and you can search for free nonprofit vendors. And if they have them in the database, it will pop up with their address and their tax ID. So that is another way to find some tax IDs. And then the last way that's really formal because it is a paid subscription, but it's a tool called Ein Finder. Now, I have used this in the past, but it doesn't, like, you won't get like 100%. I think the best percentage that I've received as far as finding missing tax IDs is like 40%. So if you get approval to get that subscription, just understand that you're not going to get the majority of them found. So, which is why I say the best way is to just reach out to that vendor with a W-9. A blank W-9 and have them fill it out and give it back to you. Now, if you do find any missing tax IDs on either the EDGAR tool on this with the Security Exchange Commission or with Melissa Data for nonprofit vendors or EIN Finder, make sure that you also do a double check and do that IRS 10 match, whether you're doing that on 10check.com or you're doing it with the IRS. I also know that there's some other platforms that you may be using, especially this time of year, 1099 software. I think 1099 Pro does it where they'll do the 10 match. But in any event, make sure you do a 10 match with any tax IDs that you have located, however you do that. All right, so that was number 2, which I think is very relevant for this type of year because you don't want to file your 1099 returns or tax filing with the IRS and either have missing tax IDs because you know you're going to get penalties and you know you're going to get that CP 2100 with those vendors on it, which is going to lead to that very manual B notice process. And then you also don't want to file incorrect legal name and tax ID combinations. So make sure that you do your 10 match, the bulk upload, even if it was correct at the time, the legal name and tax ID was correct at the time you onboarded the vendor. You want to make sure nothing has changed because the vendors are more than likely not going to reach out to accounts payable unless there is a change with their remittance, with them getting their payments. All right. Now, the third less frequently asked question for the vendor process is surrounding the Ofac list. And so this was another one that the other one I think I was talking about when I said it's related to like the recent fraud. So the question is, if we periodically run supplier reports against the Ofac list, and that's the Office of Foreign Assets and Control, and a reminder that U.S. entities and individuals are not to do business with vendors that are on that list. So the question is, if we periodically run supplier reports against the Ofac list, how long should we keep the file comparisons? So my answer is to use the same retention schedule for the watch list results file as is or that is required for the invoice or the purchase order or whatever drove that transaction. The standard invoice activity, I believe, is 7 or 10 years, but your company may have a whole separate retention schedule. So make sure that you follow that retention schedule and keep that comparison for as long as you are doing business with the vendors that are included on there. And so if you've got multiple vendors, you need to keep it as long as that, as the longest transaction or as long as vendors that are on that list continue to have transactions. And you also want to or may want to follow up internally to see if there is a separate retention schedule or maybe that is addressed in your risk management policy or procedure for risk compliance. It should also include an internal process for when a vendor legal name actually does appear on the watch list. You need to know, or your team members need to know what to do. So reach out to confirm whether there is a separate retention schedule related to these Ofac lists or these watch list results, and then also verify if there's an internal process when a vendor legal name does appear on one of those watch lists. All right, so that was the 3 least frequently asked questions or not so frequently asked questions when onboarding new vendors. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 165th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.